She organized his empire, memorized his secrets, and built 4 years of loyalty so deep that the company would collapse without her. Then he handed her an invitation to plan his wedding, to another woman. Naomi Carter didn't scream. She didn't cry. She picked up her pen and started writing the seating chart for the man she loved. But the story you're about to hear isn't about heartbreak. It's about what happens when the most indispensable woman in the room finally decides she's done being invisible. Stay until the end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The elevator doors opened at 5:47 in the morning, and Naomi Carter was already there. She was always already there. The 42nd floor of Blackwood Maritime's headquarters sat dark and silent at that hour. The kind of silence that smelled like recycled air and carpet cleaner, and the faint ghost of last night's takeout someone had forgotten to throw away. Naomi moved through it the way water moves through familiar terrain, without hesitation, without wasted motion. She hit the lights in the executive corridor one by one, not because she needed to, but because she had learned 4 years ago that Adrian Blackwood arrived before 6, and he could not stand walking into darkness. Small things. It was always the small things. She set his coffee on the desk, black, no sugar, the third brew of the pot because the first 2 runs were always slightly off in temperature, and Adrian's tongue was sensitive to things most people would never notice. She laid out the morning brief she'd been editing since 4 a.m., clipping the pages in the lower left corner because he read from right to left out of habit, and a center clip always irritated him. She checked the blinds, adjusted them 2 inches downward so the morning sun wouldn't hit the monitor screen when it crested the Newark skyline around 7:15. Then she sat down at her own desk, 20 feet away, and one wall of glass between them, and she opened her laptop and began the actual work. By the time the rest of the building breathed itself awake, Naomi had already prevented 2 scheduling conflicts, flagged a contract clause that would have cost the company roughly $400,000, and quietly reminded 3 vice presidents about a board meeting they had collectively forgotten. Nobody thanked her. They never really did. That wasn't the deal. She told herself that was fine. Naomi was 34 years old, and she had been telling herself things were fine for a long time. She was a large woman, not the kind that fashion magazines acknowledged with reluctant grace, but genuinely, solidly large, with wide shoulders that carried the tension of a dozen men's responsibilities and hands that were always slightly dry from washing them too often between tasks. Her skin was deep brown, the color of good soil, and she kept her natural hair pulled back during the week in twists that she wrapped tight enough to give herself a mild headache by Thursday afternoon. Her face, when she was focused, looked like it was made for focus, jaw set, eyes tracking everything, the faint groove between her brows that her mother used to call her war line. She was not beautiful in the way the women on this floor were beautiful. She knew that. She had learned it the hard way, in increments, over 4 years of watching men look through her to the woman behind her, the one who didn't know the quarterly numbers but wore better shoes. But Adrian had never looked through her. That was the thing. That was always the thing. He saw her, or she had believed he did. She was still turning that belief over in her mind, examining it the way you examine something you're not sure is real anymore, when the elevator opened at 6:02 and Adrian Blackwood walked onto the floor. He was 38, but he moved like a man who had been old a long time. There was a kind of gravity to him. Not height, though he had that too, but weight. The weight of someone who knew what it meant to carry things that couldn't be put down. His face was angular, handsome in a way that was functional rather than decorative, and he had the eyes of a man who had been in rooms where very bad decisions were made and survived them all. His family's shipping empire moved more cargo through East Coast ports than most people would ever know, and the parts of the business that didn't appear in any annual report, the alliances with men whose names never appeared in print, the debts paid in ways the IRS would find creative, those were the parts that kept him from ever fully sleeping. Naomi knew all of it. Every shadow in the ledger, every name he spoke only in private. She kept it the way a locked room keeps secrets, not because she was told to, but because she understood that some information, placed in the wrong hands, could get people killed. That knowledge sat between them always, unspoken and enormous. She had thought once that it meant something, a kind of intimacy. The intimacy of being trusted with the truth of a person. Morning, he said, walking past her desk without stopping. Morning. Board minutes from Tuesday are on your desk. The clause on the Rotterdam contract is flagged in red, and Donovan called at 5:30. I told him you'd call back after 9. He stopped at his door. Didn't turn around. Donovan call on my direct line? Your cell. A pause. His shoulders did something small and tight. How'd he get my cell? I don't know, Naomi said. But I'm going to find out before 9. He went inside. She heard the chair creak, heard him pick up the coffee, heard the specific silence that meant he was reading and had entered the state of focus that required no interruption for the next 40 minutes. She went back to work. This was what 4 years looked like. This was what devotion distilled into routine looked like. And for a long time, a long, embarrassing time, if she was honest with herself, Naomi had convinced herself that this was enough. That this nearness, this necessity, this being the person he could not function without, was a kind of love returned. She was wrong. She just didn't know it yet. The morning moved the way mornings in that building always moved, fast and functional, crisis and correction, the constant low hum of an empire keeping itself alive. Naomi ate a protein bar at her desk at 8:30 and called it breakfast. She managed 2 supplier disputes before 10, sat in on a conference call with the Singapore Port Authority as Adrian's proxy, and made 4 decisions he would have made himself because she knew exactly how he thought. And then she spent 45 minutes calming down a senior VP named Gerald Marsh, who was technically her superior in every way that appeared on an org chart, and who called her sweetheart twice before she cut him off so cleanly he didn't even realize he'd been cut. That was the invisible work, the work no one measured. At 11:45, Adrian appeared at her door. He looked different, not visibly. His face was the same arrangement of controlled angles. But there was something in the way he was standing, a stillness that was too deliberate to be natural. Naomi had learned to read the small weather systems of his posture the way sailors read clouds. This one said he was about to say something he'd already decided about and was not going to renegotiate. She kept her eyes on her screen. Whatever you're about to say, I'm going to need 5 minutes to finish this before I can give you my full attention. Take your time, he said. He never said take your time. He said things like when you get a chance and circle back, both of which meant immediately. Take your time meant something else. Take your time meant he felt something close to discomfort. Naomi filed the last 3 entries, saved the document, and looked up. Okay. He came in, sat in the chair across from her desk. Not the one visitors used, but the one he dragged over himself the second week she'd worked for him, the one that had lived in the corner of her office ever since. He sat in it the way men sit when they're trying to look relaxed and failing. I have some news, he said. All right. Good news. His jaw moved, almost a smile. I'm getting married. The protein bar she'd eaten at 8:30 moved somewhere uncomfortable in her stomach. She kept her face exactly where it was. Congratulations, she said. Vivian Sinclair. You've met her father at the Brentwood dinner back in February. Naomi had met Dominic Sinclair. She had also quietly researched his organization at Adrian's request 3 months ago, documented 4 active rivalries, 2 pending legal entanglements, and 1 daughter who appeared at charity events with the precise regularity of someone managing a public image rather than living a life. She had delivered that report on a Tuesday, and Adrian had filed it without comment. I remember, she said. The alliance makes sense. He said it the way he said most things that cost him something, flatly, efficiently, like he was reading from the brief. Their network fills a gap on the southern routes, and the Sinclairs have been looking to consolidate. It works for both sides. An alliance. That was the word he used. Not love. Not she makes me feel something I can't explain. Not even she's who I chose. An alliance. Naomi looked at her desk for exactly 2 seconds and then looked back at him. What do you need from me? He shifted. The chair creaked. The engagement gala. It'll need to be handled correctly. Venue, guest list, the logistics of getting certain attendees in the same room without creating problems. You know who I'm talking about. She did. Men who arrived with security and ate with their backs to the wall. I'll need a timeline, she said. 6 weeks. Fine. Naomi. He said her name like it was a door he was trying to open carefully. "I know this is outside your usual scope." "It's not," she said. "It's logistics. I'm good at logistics." He looked at her for a moment too long. Then he nodded and stood up and walked out and left her alone with the sound of her own breath. She didn't move for 60 seconds. She counted. She had learned a long time ago that counting was better than feeling, in the short term. It gave the feeling somewhere to wait. 60 seconds, and then she opened a new document and began the gala outline. What else was she going to do? She worked until 8 that night, alone on a floor that had emptied around her. She built the event framework with the same precision she built everything, obsessively, completely, leaving no gap for error. She knew the venue that would accommodate Adrian's world. Not the legitimate executives, but the other ones, the ones who needed sightlines and exits and rooms adjacent to the main hall where quiet conversations could happen away from cameras. She knew which florist wouldn't talk. She knew which caterer had done Sinclair events before and understood the meaning of discretion. She built it all, and she did not cry. Not then. On the subway home, standing because all the seats were taken, holding the overhead rail with her dry hands while the train shook and the lights flickered somewhere between Park Place and Church Avenue, Naomi Carter pressed her lips together and stared at a pharmaceutical advertisement across the car and let herself feel it. Just for the length of 2 stops, just for the distance between where she was and where she had to get off. It was not devastation exactly. It was something more structural than that. Like a wall you have been leaning against your whole adult life suddenly reveals that it was never solid, that it was pressure and habit and wishful architecture. And the ground beneath you is shifting not because something exploded, but because the truth, applied steadily, dissolves things slowly. She had never told him. That was the other part she had to sit with, pressed against strangers on a Monday night in November. She had never said those words, never crossed the line, never done anything that could be called inappropriate by any measure. She had loved him the way water loves the shape of the container, invisibly, accommodatingly, taking the shape of what was available, and it had cost her nothing, and it had cost her everything, and she had no one to blame. She got off at her stop. She walked the 4 blocks to her apartment building. She went inside, fed her cat, a large orange tabby named Maurice, who did not care about Adrian Blackwood or engagement galas or the shipping business, and who greeted her with the limited enthusiasm of a creature that expected dinner. And she ate leftover rice standing over the kitchen sink because sitting down felt too much like surrendering to the night. Then she sat down, at the kitchen table, with her laptop, because the gala wasn't going to plan itself. For 3 weeks she worked with the kind of focus that is indistinguishable from pain if you look at it too closely. Every detail precise, every contingency covered. She coordinated with Vivian Sinclair's personal assistant twice, a young woman named Priya, who was efficient and professional and clearly terrified of her employer. Naomi understood the feeling. She had worked for a man who made the whole world feel like it was running on his schedule. She imagined marrying into it was something else entirely. She did not meet Vivian directly until the venue walkthrough. The venue was a converted maritime warehouse in Red Hook. Adrian's idea, deliberately, with exposed beams and river views and the kind of industrial elegance that made people feel they were celebrating something serious. Naomi arrived 40 minutes early, with a clipboard she didn't need but carried anyway because it gave her hands somewhere to be. Vivian arrived exactly on time, which was its own kind of statement. She was beautiful in the way that real structural beauty operates, not assembled from product and effort, though there was certainly that too, but fundamental, in the bones, in the way light chose her. She was light-skinned with close-cropped natural hair, dressed simply in a cream coat that probably cost what Naomi made in a week, and she walked into the warehouse with the controlled ease of someone who had been told their whole life that rooms belonged to them. She looked at Naomi and smiled. It was a real smile, which surprised Naomi more than she would have liked. "You're Naomi Carter," Vivian said. Not a question. "That's right. Adrian talks about you constantly." She said it without inflection, which meant it could be anything. "We work closely together," Naomi said. "I know," Vivian said, and something moved behind her eyes. Not hostility, not yet. Something more like recognition. The kind that happens when a woman looks at another woman and understands something that neither of them will say out loud. They walked the space. Naomi ran through the layout, the sight lines, the catering positions, the private room adjacencies. She was professional and thorough and gave nothing away. Vivian listened with the attention of someone building a file. At the end, standing near the river windows, Vivian said, "You know this world better than I do. I've worked in it for 4 years." "No." Vivian shook her head almost gently. "I mean his world. Specifically." She let that sit. "That must be very useful." "It's my job," Naomi said. Vivian smiled again, and this time the warmth had gone somewhere Naomi couldn't quite locate. "Of course it is," she said. On the ride back, Naomi sat in the car and looked out the window at the East River, gray and permanent and utterly indifferent, and she understood with a clarity that settled in her chest like cold water that something had just begun. Not the gala, not the wedding, something else. Something that had been set in motion the moment Vivian Sinclair looked at her with those recognizing eyes and said the word useful like it meant something she wasn't saying. Naomi had survived 4 years of being indispensable. She had built a fortress out of competence and discretion and the kind of quiet, bone-deep loyalty that most people in Adrian Blackwood's world had long since traded away for something cheaper. She had believed somewhere in the deepest part of herself that she rarely examined directly that it would protect her. She was beginning to understand that it had made her a target, and she had no idea yet just how carefully the ground was already being cut from beneath her feet. The gala went perfectly. That was the problem. When something goes perfectly in Adrian Blackwood's world, nobody remembers who made it happen. They remember the river view and the lighting and the fact that 2 men who had been trying to destroy each other's operations for 6 years shook hands in a private room off the main hall and came out looking like old friends. They remember the food and the flowers and the way the whole evening moved like it had been choreographed by someone who understood not just logistics, but power, how it breathes, where it needs to be seen, where it needs to disappear. Nobody said Naomi Carter's name once that night. She stood near the service corridor at 10:47 p.m., holding a radio she didn't need anymore because every moving piece had landed exactly where she'd placed it, and she watched Adrian and Vivian receive their guests from across the room. He was in a dark suit, and he had his hand at the small of Vivian's back, and Vivian was wearing something the color of champagne that caught every light in the room without trying. They looked like a photograph of something inevitable. They looked like an alliance that had already won. Naomi went home at 11. She took the subway. She ate nothing. Maurice headbutted her ankle when she came through the door, and she sat on the kitchen floor with him for a while, her back against the cabinet, her dress still on, her heels still on, until her feet started hurting enough that she had to take them off. Then she went to bed and stared at the ceiling and told herself the worst was over. She was wrong about that too. It started small enough that she almost convinced herself it wasn't starting at all. The first Monday after the gala, Naomi arrived at her usual time, 5:51 a.m., 2 minutes later than usual because the L train had stalled, and found that the morning brief she normally prepared for the executive team had already been distributed, not by her. The email had come from Vivian's assistant, Priya, at 5:30 a.m., and it contained most of what Naomi would have written, close enough that it wasn't wrong, but off in 3 specific places that Naomi would have caught. The Rotterdam shipping adjustment was missing entirely. The note about Donovan's rescheduled call had the wrong time. She flagged both to Adrian at 6:10 when he came in. "Priya sent the brief this morning," she said. He glanced at the pages in his hand. "I know. Vivian thought it would help. The Donovan call is listed for 2:30. It's at 2. He paused. "I'll adjust. And the Rotterdam update isn't in there." "I know." His eyes moved back to the page. "I'll handle it." He went into his office. Naomi stood in the corridor for a moment, the corrected brief in her hand, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years in that building. She felt irrelevant. Not dismissed. Dismissed would have been clean, something you could push back against. This was more like being replaced so gradually that the replacement was already sitting in your chair before you noticed you'd been asked to stand. She went back to her desk. She did her work. She did not mention it again. The second thing happened the following Thursday. Adrian had a standing 9 a.m. with his 4 senior vice presidents, Marsh, Delgado, Kwan, and a newer one named Tate, who had come over from a competitor the previous spring and still moved through the office like a man who expected to be asked to leave. Naomi had sat in on this meeting every Thursday for 4 years. She didn't present, didn't lead, but she sat at the far end of the table with her laptop and her notes, and she tracked every commitment and contradiction and followed up by noon on everything that required follow-up, which was always more than anyone admitted in the room. At 8:55 that Thursday, she picked up her laptop and her notebook and walked down the corridor toward the conference room, and Gerald Marsh stepped out of his own office directly into her path, coffee in hand, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Naomi. He said her name the way he always did, weighted wrong, like it was a concession rather than a greeting. Meeting's been restructured a little. She stopped. How so? Going to be a smaller core group going forward. Operational details handled internally. His eyes went to a place slightly above her left ear. Vivian thought the support staff dynamic made the VPs less candid. Support staff. She let that word sit in the air between them without touching it. Does Adrian know? She said. It was discussed. He shifted the coffee to his other hand. Didn't he mention it to you? He had not. She knew, by the careful flatness of Marsh's expression, that he knew Adrian had not. I'll check with him, she said. She turned around and walked back to her desk. She did not check with Adrian, not because she was afraid of the answer, but because she already knew it, and there was a difference between knowing something and making it real by saying it out loud. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop and did the work she would have done in the meeting, alone, from the outside. The way you read a room by standing in the corridor and listening through the door. At noon, she sent the follow-up notes to Adrian directly. He replied 40 minutes later. Thanks. Good catches. Good catches. Like she'd been watching a game, not playing in it. The third thing was the phone calls. She noticed it first with the Singapore authority, a contact named Wei Lin Tan, who had been routing questions through Naomi for 2 years, because Naomi was the one who actually knew the answers. On a Tuesday in early December, Wei Lin called the main line and asked for Naomi, and the call was rerouted to Priya. And when Naomi found out about it 2 hours later because Wei Lin had emailed her directly with a confused note saying he'd been told she wasn't available for external logistics calls, Naomi sat very still at her desk for approximately 45 seconds. She was always available for external logistics calls. That was the single most core function of her position. She had taken calls from Singapore at 2 a.m. from her apartment because that was what the job required. She walked to Priya's desk. Priya was 26 and good at her job and had the expression of someone who had already been told today was going to be uncomfortable. Wei Lin Tan's call was rerouted this morning, Naomi said. Can you tell me why? Priya's fingers moved on her keyboard without typing anything. Miss Sinclair asked me to manage incoming operational calls while she builds familiarity with the accounts. Ms. Sinclair doesn't work here yet. A pause. She will be. After January. Priya looked at her keyboard. She wanted to start transitioning now. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Priya, to her credit, did not look away, but she also did not look comfortable. I'm going to need you to unroute those calls, Naomi said. Today. I'd have to check with... Today, Priya. She went back to her desk. An hour later, the calls were not unrouted. She knew because she called Wei Lin back directly on his cell, and he confirmed that anything coming through Blackwood's main line was still redirected. That was the day Naomi began keeping notes. Not for any specific plan. She was not, at that point, thinking about what came next, because thinking about what came next required acknowledging that what was happening now was real. And she was still in the part of the experience where you keep testing the walls, hoping one of them will turn out to be a door. She kept notes in a password-protected document she saved on her personal drive, not the company server. Dates, times, specific incidents, exact language. The notes were clean and factual and contained no emotion whatsoever, which was itself a kind of emotion. December moved like cold water. The office decorated itself in ways Naomi had no part in. Someone had ordered garland and warm lights for the executive floor. and it made the whole corridor look like the lobby of a hotel that was trying too hard. Adrian seemed to notice none of it. He moved through the seasonal transformation of his own office building the way he moved through everything that wasn't a crisis, present but untroubled, trusting that the right people were handling it. The right people. She had always been the right people. She began to understand she was being reclassified. The executive meeting happened on a Wednesday, not a Thursday, the second week of December. A scheduling change she received notice of 40 minutes before it started. Not enough time to prepare her usual notes. She arrived at the conference room and found all 5 chairs taken. Not her chair at the end, all the chairs, including the extra ones that usually lined the wall for support staff. Tate had brought 2 members of his own team. Marsh was there with a junior analyst Naomi had never spoken to. Vivienne sat at the table, not at the side. At the table, between Quan and Delgado, in the chair that had been empty for 4 years because nobody had ever wanted to claim the seat closest to Adrian's left side. Naomi was standing in the doorway with her laptop under her arm. Nobody said anything for a full 3 seconds. Then Marsh said, "We might be a bit over capacity in here." Adrian looked up from his phone. He looked at Naomi, then at the room, and she watched him do the math and come to the wrong conclusion in real time. Watched him decide this was a logistics problem rather than what it actually was. "Can you pull something from the outside?" he said to her. Not an apology, a task. She stood in that doorway for 1 more second, just one, long enough for Vivienne to glance at her from across the room with an expression that was entirely neutral and somehow the most aggressive thing Naomi had ever seen. Then she turned around and found a chair in the corridor and did not go back in. She sat outside the meeting room for 90 minutes, listening to the muffled voices, and she took her notes and she flagged her concerns, and at the end of it, she had a complete record of every decision made and every gap left in it, compiled from what she could hear and what she already knew, because she still knew everything, even from the hallway. That knowledge had not been transferred to Priya. It lived in Naomi's head, and no amount of call rerouting was going to change that. But she was beginning to understand that the people doing the rerouting didn't know that, or didn't care. It was 3 days after the corridor meeting that she finally went to Adrian. She had spent those 3 days arguing with herself about it. Not about whether to go, but about how. How to say it without sounding like she was making it personal, without it becoming about Vivienne in a way that could be used against her, without stepping into the territory of emotion, which in Adrian's world was roughly equivalent to stepping into traffic. She rehearsed the language in her head on the subway. She kept it factual. She kept it professional. She was going to walk in there and describe the operational impact, the rerouted calls, the meeting access, the morning briefs, and propose specific corrective structures, and Adrian would hear it and fix it, because Adrian was not a stupid man, and he understood what functional operations required. She walked into his office at 4:30, just before the day caved in on itself the way late December afternoons do. "Do you have 5 minutes?" He looked up from his monitor. "Sure." She sat down across from him. She had notes on her phone, a specific list, ordered by severity and operational impact. She looked at him, and she began. She told him about the calls, she told him about the meeting. She told him about the brief, about Priya, about the rerouting, about Marsh's use of the phrase support staff, which had a specific technical meaning in this company and was not, had never been, her classification. She spoke for 8 minutes. She kept her voice level. She watched his face. He listened. She could see him actually listening, the way his eyes tracked her, the way he didn't reach for his phone, the subtle shift in his posture that meant something had registered. She had watched this man listen to bad news for 4 years, and she knew the difference between him hearing and him processing, and he was doing both. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, I hear you." "Good. This sounds like the transition period is creating some friction." She looked at him. "It's not friction. Friction implies both sides are moving. I'm being stopped." He absorbed that. His jaw shifted slightly. "Have you talked to Vivienne directly?" The question hit her somewhere between her sternum and her throat. "This isn't a Vivienne issue," she said carefully. "This is an operational structure issue." "Sure," he said. "But if she's in the process of getting familiar with how things work, some of this might just be miscommunication, wires getting crossed. Crossed wires don't redirect calls from a 2-year relationship without notifying me first." Naomi, he said her name, same way he always said it. Careful, like a door. You're the best operational mind in this building. Everyone knows that. But right now there's a sensitive transition happening, and I need you to... He paused. Just handle it. You're good at handling things. She stared at him. Just handle it. He was not a cruel man. That was the part she had to keep reminding herself of, because cruelty would have been easier to deal with. He was a man who had learned to trust her competence so thoroughly that he no longer checked to see whether the thing he was handing her was something she should have to carry. He handed her problems the way you hand a master lockpicker a locked door, without thinking about what's behind it, without asking whether she wanted to open it, without registering that this particular door was one she herself was being locked behind. Just handle it. She stood up. Okay, she said. She walked out. She went back to her desk, and she sat down, and she put her hands flat on the surface of it, palms down, and she breathed, slowly. 4 counts in, the way she'd read about once in a magazine in a waiting room somewhere. 4 counts out. The kind of breathing that is less about relaxation and more about preventing yourself from doing something that can't be undone. Gerald Marsh walked past her desk at that moment and glanced at her and said, without stopping, "Hey, you get a chance. The Singapore account summary doesn't need to come through you going forward. We're streamlining the pipeline." She did not look up. "Sure, Gerald." "Great. Thanks, sweetheart." She let it go. She let it go because she was using all available energy to keep her hands flat and her breathing even and her face empty, and there was nothing left over for Gerald Marsh and his structural obliviousness. That night she called her sister Diane, who lived in Baltimore and worked in hospital administration and had the specific gift of listening without trying to fix things. "Tell me what's happening," Diane said. So Naomi told her. The calls, the meetings, the chair in the hallway. Adrian's 8 words. She told it factually, the way she'd kept the notes, and halfway through she realized her voice had changed, that some filament in it had gone thin and strained, and she stopped talking. "You still there?" Diane said. "Yeah." "He told you to handle it." "Yeah." Diane was quiet for a moment. "Naomi, baby, you know what that is?" "I know what it is." "Then you know what you have to decide." She did know. She had known, if she was honest with herself, since she'd sat outside that conference room on a folding chair in the hallway of a company she had held together with her bare hands for 4 years, listening through a door to decisions being made by people who had been in that building for 18 months, being made without her, being made worse without her, while Vivienne Sinclair sat in the chair that had always been empty and looked at the room like it had always been hers. She hadn't wanted to know. Knowing cost something she hadn't been ready to pay. The next morning, Naomi came in at her usual time. She made the coffee, she laid out the brief. She did everything she had always done, with the same precision and the same invisible grace, and nobody noticed because nobody ever noticed. And that was the point, and it had always been the point, and she had always told herself that was fine. But something had changed in the architecture of her silence. 3 weeks later, Naomi Carter was called into Adrian's office for the second time that month, and this time it was not just the two of them, and the conversation was not a conversation but a verdict. And when she walked out of that office, she did not go back to her desk immediately, but instead stood in the corridor by the window that faced the harbor, looking at the gray water below, and understood with a terrible and clarifying certainty that the worst had not been over when she'd told herself it was. It was just arriving. The second meeting in Adrian's office happened on a Thursday. Naomi knew it was going to be bad the moment she saw who was already inside. She had been summoned at 2 p.m. by a calendar invite. Not a knock on her door, not a call from Adrian directly, but a calendar invite sent by Priya at 1:47, 13 minutes notice, the kind of timeline that said the decision had already been made and this meeting was not a discussion but a delivery. She had seen the invite, closed her laptop, straightened her jacket, and walked down the corridor with her hands loose at her sides because she refused to arrive with clenched fists. Gerald Marsh was seated in the chair she normally used. Vivienne was standing near the window, one hand resting on the glass, looking out at the harbor the way people look at things they already own. A man named Richard Holt from Human Resources sat at the far end, with a manila folder and an expression of practiced compassion that Naomi had seen before on the faces of people delivering news they did not feel responsible for. Adrian was behind his desk. He looked at her when she came in, and she saw it. The specific quality of his stillness that she had learned to read years ago, the one that meant he was not comfortable but had already committed. There would be no reconsidering. Whatever was in Richard Holt's manila folder had already been signed. She did not sit down. She stood just inside the door and she looked at all of them and she waited. "Naomi," Adrian said, "thanks for coming." She said nothing. He picked up a pen, set it down. Not a hesitation, a habit, something his hands did when his mind had already moved past the moment. "We've been doing some structural evaluation of the executive support team. In light of the transition, Vivian coming on board in January, the new operational alignment," he paused. "Some changes are going to make the organization function better going forward." She waited. "Your position is going to be restructured," he said. "You'll continue in an administrative capacity, but the direct reporting line to me will shift. Going forward, you'll report to Vivian as part of the household and executive support coordination team." The room was completely silent for 3 seconds. Naomi looked at him. She looked at him without blinking, without moving, the way you look at something when you need to understand whether what you're seeing is real. Household and executive support coordination team. She had, for 4 years, been the person who decided which contracts lived and which died. She had sat across from men who frightened federal agents and held her own. She had managed a shipping operation that moved through 3 continents, navigated alliances so complex they required a separate set of notes she kept encrypted and committed to memory in parallel, and she had done all of it while making sure Adrian Blackwood never walked into a room without knowing exactly what he was walking into. And she was being moved to household coordination. "Richard has the details on the new structure," Adrian said. "Compensation stays the same. Scope is adjusted," she said. Her voice came out flat and clear, like something pressed smooth under enormous weight. "That's the word you're looking for." He stopped. "Scope is adjusted," she said. "That's what you're doing." Vivian turned from the window. Her face was composed, the kind of compose that takes years to build and costs something to maintain. "Naomi, this isn't a demotion. The role is—" "What's the reporting structure for external logistics accounts?" Naomi said, looking directly at Vivian. A pause. "Those will be handled through the new operations team." "Which you're building?" "Yes." "Who's running it?" Vivian's chin lifted, almost imperceptibly. "That's still being determined. Who are the candidates?" "Naomi." Adrian's voice had a warning in it. Not hard, but present. She turned back to him. She kept her voice exactly where it was. "I want to understand the structure I'm being moved into. Is that an unreasonable request?" "This isn't the right time for— You're asking me to give up direct access to accounts I've managed for 4 years, to report to someone who has been in this building 3 times, and to do it in the next—" She glanced at the calendar invite still visible on her phone. "Effective 2 weeks from today. When is the right time?" Marsh shifted in his chair. Holt opened his folder and looked at something inside it with great concentration. Adrian stood up. He came around the desk, and for a moment she thought he was going to do something unexpected, say something honest, step outside the structure of the meeting and just speak to her, the way they had spoken for 4 years when it was just the 2 of them in the early morning hours when the building was still dark and the real work was happening. He stopped 3 feet from her. "I know this is a lot to absorb," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "it is. I need this transition to go smoothly. I need you in it, not against it." She looked at his face, the specific geography of it, the jaw she had watched tighten through 100 crises, the eyes that she had once believed could see her, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not break. She had passed breaking some weeks ago. This was something else, something more final, like a tide that had been going out for a long time, finally reaching its full distance and beginning, very slowly, to turn. "I understand," she said. She took the folder from Richard Holt's extended hand. She did not look at its contents. She walked out of the office, pulled the door closed behind her with exactly the right amount of pressure. Not a slam, not a careful click, just the ordinary sound of a door being closed. And she walked to her desk. She sat down. She set the folder on her desk. She put her hands flat on the surface again, palms down, and she breathed. And then something happened that she had not planned for. Priya was at the desk across the corridor, and Priya was on the phone. And Priya did not know that Naomi was back or that the door to Adrian's office was closed. And Priya was speaking in the careful, quiet voice of someone who believes they are not being overheard. Yes, she took it. I don't know, she didn't. No, she's not going to cause problems. She's not that kind of person. A pause. Priya's voice dropped further. Miss Sinclair already has the Singapore contacts. I forwarded the full account list 2 weeks ago. Weilin Tan confirmed the handoff. A longer pause. The Rotterdam file? That went over Monday. The Donovan correspondence, everything, all of it. Naomi sat very still. She was not breathing anymore. She had stopped at the word forwarded. Priya continued, the encryption keys for the secondary server. Yes, I have those. Ms. Sinclair has the physical copies already. Another pause, shorter. Naomi doesn't know about any of it. She thinks it's just call routing. And there it was, not call routing, not transition friction, not miscommunication. This had been a transfer. A deliberate, systematic, weeks-long transfer of everything Naomi had built. Every contact, every account, every file, every piece of institutional knowledge that existed in the structure of Blackwood Maritime, conducted in parallel to Naomi's daily presence, using access Priya had obtained through Vivian, who was not yet an employee, who had no legal standing to request proprietary client data, who had nonetheless received it, piece by piece, forwarded from a desk 20 feet from Naomi's own. She turned her head and looked at Priya. Priya looked up. The call died instantly. She moved her phone from her ear with the specific speed of someone who has been caught doing something that cannot be explained. They looked at each other across the corridor. Naomi stood up. Priya's face went through 3 expressions in under a second. Guilt, calculation, something that settled finally into a kind of desperate neutrality. The secondary server encryption keys, Naomi said. Her voice was so even it didn't sound like her. You forwarded those to Vivian Sinclair. Priya said nothing. Those keys are classified at level 4, Naomi said. They protect correspondence between Adrian and 3 individuals whose names are not on any company document. Forwarding them to an external party. She stopped. She recalibrated. Does Adrian know? Priya's mouth opened. Ms. Sinclair said, Does Adrian know? A pause that answered everything. Naomi turned and walked back to Adrian's office. She did not knock. She opened the door. Marsh was still there. Holt was closing his folder. Vivian was still at the window. Adrian looked up with the expression of someone who had expected the meeting to be over. The level 4 encryption keys for the secondary correspondence server, Naomi said. Were you aware that Vivian has them? Silence. Something moved across Adrian's face, fast, almost invisible, but she had been watching his face for 4 years and she caught it. It was not surprise. It was the expression people make when a fact they had filed somewhere inconvenient is suddenly placed directly in front of them in public. That's a separate matter, he said. Separate from what? From this meeting. Adrian. She put his name down carefully. That server contains communication records with Donovan, with the Calabrese account, with people whose exposure and discovery would be catastrophic. If those keys leave this building in Vivian's possession before she is legally an employee of this company, before any non-disclosure structure is in place, I said it's a separate matter. It's a criminal exposure matter. The temperature in the room dropped. Vivian turned from the window. For the first time since Naomi had met her, the composure showed its seams. Not anger, something colder than anger, something that lived underneath it. You're not in a position to determine what constitutes exposure, Vivian said. You're an administrative employee. I'm the person who built the data architecture for this organization from the ground up, Naomi said. I know exactly what's on that server because I'm the one who designed the classification structure. And I know that if the wrong federal office pulls the wrong thread at the wrong moment, those keys become evidence. That's enough, Adrian said. He was standing now. His voice had gone to the place it went when conversation was over. Naomi, that's enough. She looked at him. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough for him to see that she was not afraid, long enough for him to understand that she was not raising this because she was panicking, but because it was true and it was dangerous, and she was, even now, trying to protect him. Okay, she said. She walked out again. This time she did not go back to her desk. She walked to the elevator, rode it to the lobby, walked through the lobby and out the glass doors, and stood on the sidewalk in the December air, without her coat, and she let the cold hit her face, and she breathed. It was 3:18 in the afternoon. The city moved around her. Cabs, pedestrians, a delivery truck idling at the corner, a woman with a stroller navigating the uneven concrete with that particular focused urgency of someone who had somewhere specific to be. Naomi stood in the middle of all of it, and for the first time in 4 years she had absolutely no idea what to do next. She had been protecting him. That was the bottom of it. That was the thing she had to look at directly, out here in the cold where there was no desk to put her hands on and no work to convert the feeling into. She had spent 4 years protecting an empire that was not hers, guarding a man who did not fully see her, carrying information that could detonate careers and freedoms and possibly lives, carrying it faithfully, carrying it silently, carrying it because she believed in the structure of what they had built together, even if her name was not on any of the load-bearing walls. And she had just told him about a vulnerability that could destroy him, and he had told her it was a separate matter, and Vivian Sinclair had called her an administrative employee, and Gerald Marsh was still inside that building with her chair. She went back upstairs. She had to. There were things she needed to get before she could do what she was beginning to understand she was going to have to do. She moved fast and quiet, the way she always moved. She went to her desk. She pulled her personal drive from the locked drawer where she kept it. Not the company drive, her own, the one she had purchased herself and which contained nothing belonging to Blackwood Maritime except the notes she had been keeping since December. Her incident log, her records. She copied nothing from the company servers. She took nothing that wasn't already hers. She was precise about this, precise in the way you are precise when you know that every action is potentially a document. She took her personal planner, her 2 personal notebooks, the ones with her handwriting, her frameworks, the operational architecture she had developed over 4 years that existed nowhere else because she had kept it in her head and on paper rather than on any company-owned device, a habit she had developed in year 1 because she had understood early that in Adrian's world, digital records were complicated things. She opened her bottom drawer and took out the photograph she kept there. Not framed, just a photograph of herself and Diane at their mother's 65th birthday, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, their mother between them with her hand on both their shoulders. She looked at it for a moment, then she put it in her bag. She sat down. She opened a new document, blank, clean, the cursor blinking at the top of the page. She typed the date. She typed, "Dear Mr. Blackwood." She sat there for 60 seconds looking at those 3 words. Then she kept writing. She wrote for 12 minutes. She did not use accusations. She did not describe what she felt. She used precise professional language to describe the circumstances, to affirm the confidential nature of the information she held and her commitment to maintaining that confidentiality, and to state clearly and without drama that effective immediately she was resigning her position. She did not write, "You chose the wrong woman." She did not write, "I built this and you handed it to someone else." She did not write, "4 years." She wrote, "Thank you for the opportunity." She wrote, "I wish you well." She wrote it and she meant it, which was the worst part, the part that sat in her chest like something that had no name in any language she knew. She printed the letter, she signed it, she put it in an envelope addressed to Adrian Blackwood, and she set it on his desk while he was still in the conference room with the others, while Vivian was still at the window she had claimed, while Marsh was still in the chair. She went back to her desk. She picked up her bag. She put on her coat. She shut down her computer. The floor was mostly empty. Late afternoon, people in meetings, people already beginning to drift toward end of day. No one was watching. No one was at the entrance to say goodbye to, because the people who would have noticed her leaving were all behind closed doors making decisions she was no longer part of. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. The doors opened. She stepped in. She pressed the lobby button and watched the doors close, and she looked at her reflection in the polished metal. Her face, her wide shoulders, her natural hair pulled back the way she always wore it on a Thursday, her eyes clear and dry and looking back at her with an expression she had never seen on herself before. Not grief, not relief. Something more severe and more quiet than both. She looked like someone who had finally stopped negotiating with a reality that was never going to change. The elevator descended. The numbers dropped. She watched them in the panel above the door. 42, 41, 40, and down through all the floors that represented 4 years of her life. The contracts won, the crises dissolved, the knowledge accumulated in layers so dense they had become part of her skeleton. The love she had translated into competence because competence was the only currency the place would accept. The doors opened on the lobby. Naomi Carter walked out of Blackwood Maritime's building on a Thursday afternoon in December, and the cold air met her like it had been waiting, and she did not look back at the glass doors behind her, did not look up at the 42nd floor, did not perform any of the gestures of departure that a different story might require. She just walked. For the first time in 4 years, she had nowhere to be before sunrise, and no one's coffee to make, and no crisis that required her hands. The city block stretched out ahead of her, ordinary and indifferent and completely open. She had 12 contacts in her personal phone who had, over the years, told her to call them if she ever wanted to make a move. She had never called them. She had filed their words the way she filed everything, carefully, in the right location, for future reference. She pulled out her phone. She scrolled to a name she had not touched in 14 months. A woman named Cassandra Holt, who ran a logistics operation out of a building 12 blocks north, who had sat across from Naomi at an industry dinner 2 years ago and said, with the flat directness of someone who did not have time for indirect things, "You're the most operationally intelligent person in this room. The fact that you're someone's secretary is a waste I find personally offensive." Naomi had laughed it off. She had gone back to work. She was not laughing now. She stood on the sidewalk with her thumb over Cassandra Holt's name and the December wind moving through the gap between buildings with a cold that had teeth in it, and she thought about what it meant to call this number, what it meant to stop being the person who held everything together for someone else and start being the person who built something for herself. And the thought was enormous and terrifying, and underneath the terror was something she had almost forgotten the feeling of. She pressed call. It rang twice. Cassandra Holt. Naomi took one breath, slow, full, the kind that fills the bottom of the lungs first, and she said, "This is Naomi Carter. I heard you have a Director of Strategic Operations position open. I'd like to talk." A pause. Then, "I've had that position open for 8 months, Naomi. I was waiting to see how long it took you to figure out you deserved it." Another pause, shorter. "Can you come in tomorrow?" "Yes," Naomi said. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood on the sidewalk for another 3 seconds. Around her, the city continued its ordinary chaos. Horns, voices, the hydraulic exhale of a bus, a child somewhere close by laughing at something with the specific unguarded joy of someone who did not yet know what the world cost. Naomi Carter picked a direction and started walking. Behind her, 42 floors up, Adrian Blackwood was returning to his office with Gerald Marsh and a sense of efficient resolution, and he was going to find the envelope on his desk, and he was going to open it, and he was going to read 12 minutes of the most precise and devastating professional language he had ever encountered, and he was going to understand all at once, with the particular vertigo of a man who has just stepped off a surface he thought was solid, exactly what he had done. But that was behind her now. Naomi walked north into the wind, toward the direction of something she did not yet have a name for, but could, for the first time, almost feel the shape of. The call with Cassandra Holt lasted 11 minutes. By the time Naomi reached the subway entrance at the corner of Fulton and Broadway, she had a meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning, a temporary building pass waiting at the front desk of Holt Logistics, and the specific sensation in her chest of a woman who has just done something irreversible and is only now beginning to understand what irreversible feels like from the inside. It felt like falling, but the kind of falling where you've already let go of the ledge, where the decision is made, where the only direction left is down and through and out the other side into whatever the ground turns out to be. She took the subway home. She fed Maurice. She sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water she didn't drink, and she looked at the wall and she let herself feel the full weight of the day. The meeting, the folder, Priya's voice saying all of it, the letter on his desk, the elevator, Cassandra Holt's voice saying, "I was waiting to see how long it took you." And she sat with all of it until it was just facts, just the solid architecture of what had happened, and then she went to bed. She slept for 6 hours straight, which was 2 more than she normally managed. She woke at 4:47 a.m. out of pure muscle memory, lying in the dark of her bedroom with Maurice a warm weight at her feet, and she thought, "I don't have to go in before sunrise anymore." She lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling. Then she got up, made coffee, and prepared for the most important meeting of her professional life. Holt Logistics occupied the top 3 floors of a building on West Street that had a direct view of the Hudson and smelled like new carpet and ambition. Not the old inherited kind that lived in Blackwood Maritime's granite and glass, but something newer and hungrier, a company that was growing fast and knew it, and had not yet had to decide what it was willing to do to keep growing. Naomi noticed all of this in the 40 seconds it took to cross the lobby, because noticing environments was as involuntary for her as breathing. Cassandra Holt met her at the elevator. Not a receptionist, not an assistant. Cassandra herself, which said something. She was in her late 40s, compact and direct, with close-cropped silver hair that she had clearly stopped fighting at some point and started wearing like a flag. She had the handshake of someone who had spent years in rooms where handshakes were evaluated. And she looked at Naomi with the clear, uncomplicated attention of someone who had already decided something and was now simply confirming it. "You look like someone who didn't sleep," Cassandra said. 6 hours, Naomi said. "I'm functional." "Good enough." She stepped back and gestured toward the corridor. "Come on, I'll show you what we're working with." What they were working with was a logistics operation that was doing $300 million in annual revenue with an operational structure built for a company doing half that. Cassandra walked her through it in 40 minutes, talking fast and pointing at things on screens and whiteboards and occasionally at people, introducing them by name and function with the specific efficiency of someone who actually knew her employees. And Naomi listened and mapped and began, without meaning to, identifying the gaps. She couldn't help it. It was like breathing. "Singapore," she said, interrupting Cassandra mid-sentence at one point. Cassandra stopped. "What about it?" "Your Singapore routes are single-threaded. One account manager, one relationship, no redundancy. If that person leaves or that relationship sours, the whole corridor collapses," Cassandra said. She was looking at Naomi with an expression that was almost a smile. "How long did it take you to see that?" "About 4 minutes. My last operations director took 8 months," she folded her arms. "The position is yours if you want it. I'm not running a formal search. I've been watching you for 2 years, and I know what you can do. The question is whether you're done being someone else's foundation." Naomi looked at her. "What does the role actually mean here? Not the title, the authority." "Full decision rights on operational structure, supplier relationships, and route architecture. You report to me. Nobody else has access to your team without your authorization." Cassandra paused. "You sit at every table, Naomi, every one. And your name goes on the work you do. Your name goes on the work you do." Naomi stood in the middle of Holt Logistics on a Friday morning in December, and she felt something crack open in her chest. Not painfully, but the way a window cracks open in a room that has been sealed too long, the way air comes in. "Yes," she said, "I want it." She started the following Monday. The first 3 months were the hardest work of her professional life, which was saying something. Building operational infrastructure from the inside of a growing company was nothing like maintaining one that was already established. It required a different kind of thinking, creative rather than protective, expansive rather than defensive. Naomi worked 10-hour days and loved every one of them in the specific bone-deep way you love something that is asking everything from you and giving something real in return. Cassandra gave her the authority she had promised. When Naomi walked into a room, people listened. When she made a decision, it held. When she put her name on a document, it meant something. Not just internally, but externally. In the conversations she began to have with port authorities and logistics partners and shipping executives who started learning, gradually, that there was a new director of strategic operations at Holt who knew the East Coast corridor better than anyone currently working it. She did not think about Adrian Blackwood every day. This was a victory she allowed herself to register quietly. The first week it was constant, his voice, his posture, the specific weight of 4 years of proximity. By the third week it was intermittent. By the second month it was occasional, the way a healed injury occasionally reminds you of itself. She thought about the work she'd left behind. She thought about the secondary server and the encryption keys and whether he'd fixed it, whether anyone had explained to him the full scope of what Priya had forwarded and what it meant. She told herself it wasn't her problem anymore. She was mostly able to believe that. It was on a Tuesday in March, 11 weeks after she'd walked out of Blackwood Maritime, that the first crack appeared in Adrian's empire, loud enough that she heard it from across the city. She was in a meeting with Cassandra and 3 members of her own team when her phone lit up on the table beside her. She had a habit of keeping it face up during meetings, a leftover from 4 years of being the person everyone called when something was going wrong. Old habits. She glanced at the screen. It was a news alert. Blackwood Maritime. She clicked it and read the first 2 sentences and set the phone face down again and did not react. After the meeting, she stood in her office alone and read the full article. The Rotterdam contract had collapsed. Not quietly. Publicly, with the kind of public collapse that happened when 3 parties simultaneously withdrew and issued statements that were technically neutral and practically damning. The language in each statement was careful, the kind of careful that meant lawyers had been involved. But the effect was unmistakable. 3 long-standing partners had decided, within the same 10-day window, that Blackwood Maritime was no longer a relationship they wanted to maintain. Naomi read it twice. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up the Rotterdam file from memory. Not the file itself, which lived on servers she no longer had access to, but the structure of it, the relationships involved, the specific vulnerabilities she had flagged in the brief that had never made it into Priya's morning summary. The 3 parties that had withdrawn were exactly the 3 she would have called first if she'd felt the contract shifting. She closed the laptop. She went back to work. Over the following 6 weeks, she heard more. Some of it through industry channels. Logistics was a small enough world that significant failures moved through it like weather. Some of it through former colleagues who called or texted with the careful, slightly guilty tone of people sharing information they knew they probably shouldn't. The Singapore corridor had degraded. The account with Wei Lin Tan was in dispute. Something about miscommunication in the handoff, details that didn't match, expectations that hadn't been managed. 2 shipping routes through the southern network, the ones the Sinclair Alliance was supposed to strengthen, were hemorrhaging because the Sinclair organization's operational capacity was not what it had appeared to be in the merger documents. And nobody at Blackwood Maritime had possessed the specific knowledge required to identify that discrepancy before it became a problem. Nobody except Naomi, who had built the framework for evaluating exactly that kind of discrepancy, and had not been in the room when it mattered. She felt something about this that she could not cleanly categorize. Not satisfaction. It was too sharp and too sad to be satisfaction. Not vindication. She had not wanted to be right about this particular thing. Something more complex than either. The specific grief of watching something you built get dismantled by people who didn't understand what they were taking apart. She did not call Adrian. She did not send a message. She kept her head down and her focus on the work in front of her, which was growing and real and hers, and she kept going. The meeting request came on a Wednesday evening in April. She saw it on her personal email, not her work account, her personal one, sent from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "Request for conversation." The body was 3 sentences. It said that Adrian Blackwood would like to meet, at a location of her choosing, at a time that was convenient to her, and that the purpose was not professional but personal. It said he understood if she declined. She read it 3 times. Then she forwarded it to Diane with no accompanying text. Diane responded in 4 minutes. "What are you going to do?" She didn't answer that night. She went home, fed Maurice, ate an actual dinner sitting at an actual table, and thought about it with the same clean, systematic attention she brought to operational problems, because that was how her mind worked, and she had stopped apologizing for it. He had found her personal email. That was either a gesture of respect, not going through official channels, not making it a business matter, or it was something else. She turned it over, examining it for what it actually was, rather than what she wanted it to be, which was a lesson she had learned the hard way and did not intend to unlearn. She wrote back in the morning. She said she would meet him. She named a coffee place near the Hudson waterfront, a Tuesday at noon, because Tuesday at noon was when she had a 45-minute window between a supplier call and a team review, and she was not rearranging her schedule. He was already there when she arrived. She had thought about this, what it would feel like to see him again. She had run through several versions in her mind, the version where she felt nothing, which she suspected was too optimistic, the version where she felt everything, which she was not going to allow, the version where she felt something specific and manageable that she could sit with without it compromising the conversation. She felt all three versions simultaneously, which was what actually happened when you had loved someone in silence for 4 years and then watched them hand you a verdict in front of Gerald Marsh and walk away from it. He looked tired. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the expensive coat or the careful posture, but the specific tiredness that lived behind his eyes, the kind that sleep doesn't fix because it isn't about sleep. He stood up when she came in, and she noted that, and she sat down across from him and said nothing. He sat back down. He looked at her. "You look good," he said. "I know," she said. A short silence. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, something more complicated. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Okay." "Not for the restructuring." He said it directly, which surprised her. "For before that. For all of it before that." She waited. "I knew what you were doing," he said. "I knew what it cost. I knew the calls at 2 a.m. and the problems you solved before I knew they existed, and He stopped. His jaw worked. "I told myself it was because you were good at your job, which you are, which is true, but it wasn't the whole truth." "No," she said, "it wasn't. I let you be indispensable instead of—" He stopped again, put his hands on the table, flat, and looked at them. "I didn't look at you. I looked at what you did. And those are different things, and I knew it, and I kept choosing not to." The coffee shop around them was doing its ordinary Tuesday business. Keyboards and quiet conversations and the grinding of an espresso machine, the specific background noise of a city that continued without reference to the weight of any individual conversation happening inside it. Naomi looked at his hands on the table. Hands she had seen sign contracts, slam desks, move through the air when he was thinking through a problem. Hands she had never held. "The Sinclair engagement," she said. "Where is that?" He looked up. "Over, 3 months ago." She had heard this too from the industry channels. She waited to see if he would explain it or perform it. He didn't perform it. "Vivian and I wanted different things. She wanted leverage, and I wanted—" A pause. "I thought I wanted an alliance. Turns out I wanted to stop being alone in a room with decisions that had no right answer." He looked at her directly. "I'd confused those two things for a long time." "That's honest," she said. "Late," he said, "but honest." She looked at him, the tiredness in his face, the specific quality of a man who had lost things and knew it, and was not trying to dress it up as anything other than what it was. She had spent 4 years reading this face in conference rooms and early mornings and the backs of cars going to meetings in cities they were never really present in, and she knew the difference between the face he showed the world and the face underneath it, and right now she was looking at the one underneath. "Adrian," she said, "I need you to hear what I'm about to say without making it into something smaller." He nodded. "I love this job because it was real. What we built, the operation, the structure, the years of it, that was real. And I was proud of it." She held his gaze. "And I loved you. I'm not performing that past tense. I'm telling you what was true. I loved you while you looked through me for 4 years, and I never said it because you never gave me a language for it, and that was both our faults in different proportions. He said nothing. His throat moved. But I'm not the same woman I was in December, she said. She gave everything she had to something that didn't see her. I don't do that anymore. She picked up her coffee. So if you're here to apologize, I accept it. If you're here because the Empire is struggling and you want me back in an operational role, I'm not, he said, fast, clear. She stopped. I'm not here for the company, he said. The company it's a mess, and I'm dealing with it, and it's not why I'm here. He looked at her with the expression of a man doing something difficult without a net. I'm here because I spent 4 months understanding what I lost, and it wasn't an operations director. Naomi set down her coffee. Around them, the espresso machine ground and released, and someone's phone rang and was answered, and a chair scraped against the floor, and the ordinary, relentless ordinariness of being alive in a city continued without any acknowledgement of the fact that something enormous was being navigated at a corner table by two people who had spent 4 years speaking entirely in the language of work and were only now trying a different one. I'm not coming back to Blackwood Maritime, she said. I know. Adrian, I'm not a backup. I'm not what you find after Vivian. I'm not the person who is always there, who will always be there, I know, he said again. And the way he said it was different from the way he said things when he had decided something and wasn't reconsidering. It was quieter, more careful. The voice of a man who was aware he did not have the right to anything in this room and was not going to pretend otherwise. Then what are you asking? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. Nothing, he said. Not right now. I'm not asking for anything right now. He reached for his own coffee. I needed you to know that I see you, not what you can do. You. He paused. That's all. That's the whole thing. The Tuesday noon light came through the window and landed on the table between them, and Naomi Carter sat with the weight of that sentence. 4 words, simple as anything, the specific 4 words she had waited 4 years to hear. And she felt something move in her chest that was not quite any of the emotions she had planned for. She sat with it. She did not rush it. Okay, she said finally. He nodded. We should go, she said. I have a meeting at 1. Right. He stood when she stood. Old habit. She had noticed it 4 years ago and noticed it still. Naomi. She looked at him. Cassandra Holt is the best operator on the East Coast besides you, he said. I hope she knows what she has. She does, Naomi said. That's what it feels like. She picked up her bag. She put on her coat. She walked to the door and pushed it open into the April air, which had finally decided to be warm, which smelled like river and exhaust and the specific greenish hopefulness of a city in early spring. And she walked the 6 blocks back to her building and took the elevator to her floor and sat down at her desk, in her office, with her name on the door. And she pulled up the supplier report she needed for the 1 o'clock meeting. She worked through it with the focus that had always been hers, the focus that no one had given her and no one could take. And at some point in the next 40 minutes, she became aware that the tightness she had been carrying in her shoulders since December had loosened by some fraction she could not precisely measure, but could feel. She had said the true thing out loud, to his face, in the daylight. It had not killed her. It had not diminished her. It had not given him anything she wasn't willing to give. At 12:58, she got a text from an unknown number that resolved, when she looked at the contact, into Adrian's personal cell. Not the business line, the one he kept separate, the one she had never had because she had always communicated through official channels. The text said, "Thank you for meeting me." She looked at it for a moment. Then she put her phone face down on her desk and walked into her 1 o'clock meeting, where 7 people were waiting for her, and the work was real, and her name was on the door, and she had things left to build that were entirely and completely her own. But behind her, sitting in a coffee shop on the Hudson waterfront with an empty cup and 4 months of wreckage and something that felt cautiously and without any guarantee like the beginning of a direction, Adrian Blackwood was reaching for his phone, and he was not calling a supplier, and he was not calling a lawyer. And the decision he was beginning to make was not about the Empire at all, but about whether a man who had spent his whole life choosing utility over truth was capable, finally, of choosing something real instead? And the answer to that question was not yet written, and it would not be written quickly, and it would cost him in ways he was only beginning to understand he was willing to pay. The text sat unanswered for 3 days, not because Naomi hadn't seen it. She had seen it approximately 40 times in those 3 days. The way you see something you're not ready to respond to, quickly, sideways, then away. She saw it on the subway Tuesday evening, and again Wednesday morning while her coffee was brewing, and again Thursday at 11 p.m. when she couldn't sleep and was lying in the dark with Maurice on her chest and the city doing its quiet nighttime breathing outside the window. Thank you for meeting me. 7 words. Courteous. Careful. Leaving all the space in the world for silence as a response. She did not respond on Tuesday because she was still sorting through what the meeting had been. She did not respond on Wednesday because she was not sure what she wanted to say. She did not respond on Thursday because she was afraid, not of him, not of what he might say back, but of herself, of the specific treachery of her own heart, which had a long and well-documented history of wanting things that looked like connection and turned out to be utility dressed up in feeling. On Friday morning, she woke at 4:47 again, the old muscle memory precise as a clock, and she lay in the dark, and she had the thought, clear and unadorned, that she was tired of making decisions from a position of self-protection. That self-protection was necessary, and she did not regret learning it, but there was a version of it that became its own kind of imprisonment, the walls you built to keep the bad things out, eventually keeping everything out, and she had not come this far and built this much to live in a sealed room. She picked up her phone. She typed, "You're welcome." And then, after a pause, she typed, "If you want to talk again, you know where to find me." And then she set the phone on her nightstand and went back to sleep. He did not respond immediately. That also mattered. He responded at 11 a.m., which meant he had sat with it, which meant he was not operating from urgency or desperation, but from something more deliberate. The message said, "Same place, next Tuesday?" And then, "No agenda, just coffee." She said yes. The second meeting was easier than the first in the ways that second meetings between complicated people are always easier. The initial confrontation with reality already done, the necessary hard things already said, the particular shock of seeing each other in a context stripped of all professional scaffolding already absorbed. They sat at the same corner table and they drank coffee, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with shipping or logistics or empires of any kind. He asked about her mother. She asked about his brother, Marcus, who lived in Atlanta and who she had spoken to twice on the phone years ago while routing calls, and who had seemed, in those 2 brief conversations, like someone who had managed to grow up in the shadow of the Blackwood name without being deformed by it. "He's good," Adrian said. "He keeps asking me why I'm still in New York." "What do you tell him?" "I used to say the business." A pause. "Now I don't have a good answer." She looked at him. "Is the business still yours?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. An unconscious gesture, the kind of small physical habit that surfaces when a person is saying something true. "I'm restructuring. Legitimately this time, not just operationally. Some of the relationships, the older ones, I'm ending them." He set the cup down. "It's going to cost a significant amount of money, and more than a few people are very unhappy with me." "The Donovan relationship," she said. "Gone." She said nothing. The implications of that were considerable, and she understood them fully, and she let them sit without cataloging them out loud because she was not his operations director, and this was not a strategy meeting. "The encryption keys," she said. "Did you recover them?" "We did. It took 6 weeks in a security firm from outside the company, and it cost..." He paused. "It cost a great deal." He looked at her. "You were right about what the exposure meant. If we'd gone another month without catching it..." "I know," she said. Vivian had already made contact with 2 of the 3 individuals on the secondary server. "We don't know what was communicated. The lawyers are..." He stopped. "It's being handled. That's all I can say." Naomi absorbed that. "And Priya?" "Terminated. Immediately." His jaw tightened. She was 26 and she thought she was doing her job, and she had no concept of what she was actually moving. That doesn't excuse it, but I wanted you to know she wasn't malicious. She was used. I know, Naomi said again. She had known this from the moment she'd heard Priya's voice on the phone in the corridor. The specific quality of someone following instructions they don't fully understand is different from the quality of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. What about Vivian? Adrian was quiet for a moment. The coffee shop moved around them. Vivian is her father's daughter. She did what the alliance required. I don't think she ever pretended otherwise. He looked at his hands. I was the one who pretended it was something it wasn't. That's on me. There was something in the way he said this. Not self-pity, not performance, but the flat accountability of a man who had spent several months sitting with uncomfortable truths and had stopped looking for the exits. Naomi recognized it because she had done the same work herself, in her kitchen, on her subway rides, in the early mornings before the rest of the world woke up. The work of looking at yourself without the protective layer of your own preferred narrative. It was hard work. She respected that he was doing it. I'm not the same either, she said. I want you to know that. Not because I'm warning you, because it's fair. He looked at her. Tell me. She thought about how to say it. I spent 4 years being excellent in a container, she said. The container was your world, your needs, your structure. I was good at it because I'm good at almost everything I decide to do. But I mistook the container for a relationship. I told myself that being needed was the same as being chosen. She looked at her coffee. It's not. It took me an embarrassingly long time to understand that. You weren't wrong to believe in what you built, he said. No, but I was wrong to build it only for someone else. She looked up. I know what I'm worth now. Not in the way you say it when you're trying to convince yourself. I mean, I have evidence, real evidence. A company I helped restructure from the ground up in 8 months. A team that follows my lead because of what I know and how I work, not because I was assigned to them. A seat at every table. She said it without pride, just factually, the way you state things that are simply true. That exists now. I made it exist, and I will not trade it or minimize it or put it behind anything or anyone, including you. He held her gaze. I wouldn't ask you to. You might not mean to ask, she said. That's different from not asking. A silence. Outside the window, the April street was doing its business. A woman walking a dog, a food delivery cyclist cutting between cabs, 2 men in suits moving fast with their eyes on their phones, the ordinary, urgent choreography of a city with places to be. Naomi watched it for a moment before she looked back at him. What do you want, Adrian? Specifically, not generally. He did not hesitate this time. I want to know you. Outside the building, outside the job, outside every structure that made it easier to see what you do instead of who you are. He looked at her steadily. I want to take a long time doing it. I'm not asking for anything fast or easy or certain. I'm asking to show up and keep showing up and let you decide what that's worth as I go. Naomi looked at him for a long time. The last time someone had said they wanted to know her, outside of work, outside of function, for herself. She had been 28 years old, and the relationship had lasted 14 months and ended reasonably. Between then and now, there had been 4 years of channeling everything she had into an empire and a man who did not see her, and the work of the last several months of excavating herself back out of that investment and rebuilding on different ground. She was 34 years old, and she was tired and strong in equal measure, and she had learned the hardest possible version of every lesson she now possessed, and she was not interested in learning any of them again. I need you to understand something, she said. If we do this, whatever this is, I am not your secretary. I am not your logistics director. I am not your crisis manager. If you have a problem at 2 in the morning, you call a professional, because I will have my own problems at 2 in the morning and I will be solving them. Understood? If you make a decision that affects us without talking to me first, I will tell you what I think in language that is direct enough to be uncomfortable. Good, he said. And if you ever... She stopped. She picked her words carefully. If you ever look through me again, if you ever value what I do over who I am, I will leave, not dramatically, not with a letter on your desk. She looked at him. I'll just be gone. He held her gaze without flinching. That's fair. She studied his face, the familiar geography of it, the jaw, and the eyes. and the specific tiredness that had been there since December and was beginning, she thought, to shift into something different. Not tiredness lifting, but changing, the way weather changes, becoming something else you don't have a name for yet. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They finished their coffee. They walked out into the April air together, and the street was warm in the specific way of a city that has survived another winter and is still surprised by it, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment without any structure telling them what to do next. "I should get back," she said. "Me too." He paused. "Saturday. There's a place in Red Hook, right on the water. I'd like to take you there. Not dinner, coffee, or lunch, or whatever, just—" He stopped. "Just the harbor. I've always thought better near water." She thought about Saturday. She thought about what it meant to say yes to something that did not yet have a structure, that could not be project managed, that required a different kind of competence than anything she had spent the last 4 years developing. She thought about the woman she had been at 5:47 in the morning, arriving before sunrise to make coffee for a man who hadn't thought to look at her. She thought about the corridor, the folding chair, the letter on the desk. She thought about the elevator and the sidewalk and the cold and the phone call to Cassandra and the 8 months of building something that had her name on it. She thought about all of it, and she let it be what it was. The past, the true and specific and irreversible past, the ground she had come from. And then she let it rest. "Saturday," she said. "Noon." He nodded. She turned and walked back toward her building, and she did not look behind her, but she was aware of him standing on the sidewalk watching her go, and she let that be there too without analyzing it into nothing. The weeks that followed had no drama in them. That was perhaps the most surprising thing. She had expected, somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that had been trained by 4 years of high-stakes crisis management, that something would detonate. That the fragile and provisional thing being built between two people with complicated histories and no manual would erupt at some pressure point into something unmanageable. She had been braced for it in the specific way of someone who has learned that good things arrive with conditions. It didn't detonate. It just continued. Carefully and with difficulty and with regular friction and without any of the smoothness that fictional love promised, and therefore with the specific credibility of something real. They had the fight about the Donovan situation in early June. She found out through industry channels that Adrian had made a settlement arrangement that had implications she thought were strategically dangerous, and she told him exactly what she thought in exactly the language she had promised herself she would use, and he pushed back, and they sat across a kitchen table from each other. His kitchen, a Saturday morning, the first time she had been in that apartment, with 2 cups of cooling coffee between them, and said things that were uncomfortable in the way that honest things between honest people are uncomfortable, and eventually arrived at something that was neither of their original positions, but better than both. Afterward, he said, "Is this what you meant when you said you'd tell me what you think?" "Yes," she said. "Okay." He picked up his coffee. "I like it." "No, you don't," she said. He almost smiled. "No, but I think I need it." In July, Cassandra promoted her. The title changed, Executive Vice President of Operations, which meant a different salary and a different scope, and a seat on the board of a company that was doing $500 million in revenue and growing toward something larger than either of them had a precise vision for yet. Cassandra told her about it over lunch and watched her face while she absorbed it, and when Naomi looked up, Cassandra was watching her with the expression she had at the beginning, that first day. Uncomplicated and clear. "You've been ready for this since the first week," Cassandra said. "I know," Naomi said, which was a different answer than she would have given 8 months ago. 8 months ago, she might have deflected, minimized, turned the conversation toward the work rather than herself. Now she just said, "I know," because she did. She told Adrian that evening over the phone, not asking for anything, not his opinion or his blessing or his reaction, telling him because she wanted to share something good. "EVP," he said. "Yes." A pause. "Naomi." "What?" "I'm proud of you." He said it simply, without embellishment. I'm not saying it like I have any claim on it, just, "I'm proud of you." She sat with that for a moment. It landed differently than she had expected. Not like something she needed, but like something that was simply good to receive, the way sunlight is good to receive, not necessary, but real. "Thank you," she said. The harbor in September was different from the harbor in December. This was something Naomi noticed on the Saturday in early September when they walked along the Red Hook waterfront for the second time. The first had been in April, their Saturday, which had turned into 3 hours and then dinner, and which she now thought of as the day she understood this was actually happening. The water in September was a different color, deeper blue-green rather than the winter gray, and the light came in at a lower angle that made everything look more deliberate, like the city was being selective about what it chose to illuminate. They walked without agenda. She had learned to do this, to be in a place without managing it, without tracking the moving parts, without the low hum of crisis assessment that had been the background music of her professional life for so long. It had taken practice. She was still practicing. At one point, they stopped at a railing and looked out at the water. The harbor spread out beyond them, container ships in the distance, moving slow and enormous, the kind of ships she had built careers on understanding. She watched one pass and felt the old knowledge stir in her chest, the specific love she had for the complexity of it, the routes and the weights and the calculations, the infrastructure of a world that moved things from where they were to where they were needed. "Do you miss it?" Adrian asked. He was looking where she was looking. "The work?" "My version of it." She thought about this honestly. "I miss the scale," she said. "Your operation was larger, more moving parts, higher stakes." She paused. "But scale isn't the same as meaning. I didn't know that then." He nodded. "What about you?" she said. "Do you miss what it was before?" He was quiet for a moment. Below them, the water moved the way it always moved, continuous, indifferent, completely uninterested in the human conversations happening above it. "I miss not knowing what I'd lost," he said. "That was easier." He paused. "But easier isn't—" "No," she said. "It isn't." She looked at him, looking at the water. She thought about Gerald Marsh and the folding chair and the word support staff, and Vivian's face at the window, and Priya's voice saying she doesn't know about any of it. She thought about the letter she had placed on his desk, the elevator, the sidewalk, the cold. She thought about the protein bar at 8:30 a.m. she had called breakfast for 4 years. She thought about Maurice headbutting her ankle when she came home in the kitchen floor, and the dress she was still wearing at midnight because sitting down felt like surrendering to the night. She had carried a great deal. She would not pretend otherwise to make anyone comfortable. The weight of it had been real, and it had cost her real things, years of her personal life, a particular kind of innocence about what loyalty meant and what it returned, a trust in the idea that being indispensable would protect her. All of that was gone and would not come back, and she did not think it should. You don't earn wisdom without paying for it in something that was worth having. But she was here. She was standing at a railing above the harbor in September in a city that had never once cared whether she made it or not. And she had made it, and the work she was doing was real, and the person standing beside her was looking at the water with the face of a man who was still becoming something. Slowly, the way things become themselves when they stop performing what they think they should be. She reached out. She put her hand over his where it rested on the railing. He went very still. She felt his hand turn under hers, slowly, until his palm was up against her palm, and his fingers closed around hers, and they stood like that above the water without speaking, because there was nothing left to say that the moment wasn't already saying more precisely. She was not the woman who arrived before sunrise anymore. She was not the woman who ate protein bars at her desk and called it enough. She was not the woman who had translated love into competence because competence was the only currency the room would accept. She was Naomi Carter, executive vice president, the woman who had built 2 empires and kept her name on the second one, who had walked out of a building that couldn't function without her, and built something better on the other side of that door, who had said the true thing out loud in the daylight and survived it, who knew the difference between being needed and being chosen and had stopped accepting the first as a substitute for the second. She was 34 years old and she was tired in the good way, the way you're tired after building something real. And the harbor was blue-green in the September light, and the man beside her was holding her hand with the careful grip of someone who understood, finally, what they were holding. She did not need him. That was the part she wanted to be clear about, in her own mind, in the private inventory she kept of what was true. She had needed no one to get here. She had made the call herself. She had walked through the door herself. She had built the thing herself. She had learned her own worth from the inside through work and time and the particular education of loss. And it was hers in the way that only earned things are yours, and no one had given it to her, and no one could take it. But she had chosen him. That was different. Choosing was different from needing, and she understood the difference now in the full cellular way of someone who had lived both. And standing on this side of that distinction, the side where you reach for someone's hand because you want to, not because you're terrified of the alternative, was a different country from the one she had lived in for 4 years. She held his hand and she looked at the water. The container ships moved in the distance, slow and enormous, carrying things from where they were to where they were needed. The city rose behind them and around them, granite and glass and the accumulated weight of 8 million lives being lived in the same improbable proximity, none of them stopping for any particular story, all of them continuing. The harbor had been here before them. It would be here after. The water didn't care. But this moment, her hand in his, the September light, the smell of salt water and diesel and the faint green edge of the tide, this was real and specific and entirely theirs, and it had cost everything it was supposed to cost, and not 1 cent less, and she would not have paid less even if she could. Adrian looked at her. She looked back at him. "Okay," she said. The same word she had said in his office, months ago, when she had meant surrender. The same word she had said in the coffee shop when she had meant something more careful. Now she meant neither. Now she meant, "I am here. I chose this. I know what I am choosing." He heard it. She could see that he heard it, all of it. He looked at her the way she had once, a long time ago, in a different version of her life, quietly hoped he would look at her, not at what she could do, not at what she knew, not at the empire she could hold together with her bare hands, but at her, the actual her, the woman standing inside all of it. They stood above the harbor as the September afternoon did what September afternoons do, tilted slowly toward evening, the light going amber and then lower, the water going dark by degrees, the city beginning to reach for its own lights in the gathering dusk. She did not move. She did not need to move. She was already exactly where she had earned the right to be.